All right, welcome to the Joe Schmo Show. I am your host, Joe Pucci. Today's podcast is going to be mostly about Iran, but before we get to Iran, it is the anniversary of the January, excuse me, the January 6th riots. So, there's a brief mention about that. Democrats want to make a big deal of it. It's annoying. Um, what happened on January 6th was not acceptable. Um, Was it an insurrection? Absolutely not. Was it a coup attempt? Absolutely not. Was Trump involved at all? Absolutely not. If you believe any of the opposite, go back and go back and look at what actually happened. Stop getting your information from pieces of clips from Trump's speech. I don't have the energy to deal with the lies about President Trump on January 6th or the lies of it being an insurrection or a coup or anything of that nature. Come on, just I'll get into this later on, but today's focus is more Iran. I want to get into talking about the Iranian protests. So, since December 28th, 2025, 9 days ago, there have been protests that have consistently grown in size and in scope and in geographic dispersion in Iran. Over economic conditions, that's how it initially started. Iran is going through a severe economic downturn as a result of many factors. They've got a drought going on right now, which is putting pressure on the people to conserve water, and the regime is not able to really address the drought situation, the water situation. That's another factor. Um, but this started out as concerns over the economic life of the country, people protesting over that. As the days have gone on, it has grown into a more overtly anti regime uh, movement, shouting death to Khamenei, um, down with the regime, things of that nature. There is a segment of the population or of the protests that are calling for the return of the Shah or the exiled Prince Reza Pahlavi, um, and I believe he is exiled in the United States or Britain. I'm not sure which. He might be in the United States. That doesn't really matter. In any case, um, the first question I have is to what extent are these protests, are the demonstrations, is the motivation um, deeply held, or are they going to peter out eventually? Okay, so one of the things that the regime has been doing, which probably doesn't help them, is severe repression of these protests using live fire ammunition, like actual bullets, killing people. Okay, um, that's not going to help the regime because I think as the protests gain strength and motivation, they want an overthrow of the regime, most of them. Whether they want the return of the prince or something completely different, that is going to be an issue. But right now, what we're focused on is are the protests enough to cause the regime to fall? Okay. Um, so it would be helpful to compare this to a previous um, protest, a previous series of demonstrations and protests that have happened in Iran. You can look at the 2022 Women Life Freedom protests, um, in which there were far more casualties, over 500 deaths at the hands of regime forces. Okay. Um, it lasted longer. Of course, we're in the early stages right now of these protests. They've only been going on for less than 2 weeks as of so far. There's no sign of them declining. They have spread. So it remains to be seen how long and how wide these protests can get. How many people get out to an individual protest? It appears from the sources I have been following, which by the way are um, X accounts devoted to open source intelligence, OSINT. For the most part, I follow a variety of accounts. Some of them I trust more than others, but overall, with the variety of sources, you can kind of see a coalescing of truth among the different accounts of what's going on. The regime is really cracking down on protests in the capital, Tehran. It appears, and even though there is heavy repression, there are still massive protests going on. Well, I shouldn't say massive protests. There are large protests, medium-sized protests, hundreds, thousands of people getting out. I don't think we've seen protests that gather tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people yet. That may be coming, but it remains to be seen. Now, I find myself, I find it hard for me, or not necessarily hard, but somewhat difficult for me to balance the hopefulness that there may be regime change, because there's a good reason to want the Iranian regime to fall, and I'll get into that. With the the an objective view, and take a step back and look at what's actually happening, and is that cause for hope? Is that you know whatever? So yes, I hope that the regime does fall, and I hope that these protesters succeed. Do I expect that to happen? I really want to say yes, but I'm not sure yet. That's not pessimistic. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I can't tell yet. I don't think anyone can tell yet. The factors that will determine whether the protests succeed in overturning the regime is whether the regime continues to uh, crack down on these protests with deadly force. The more people that are killed in these protests, the more angry the people are going to be, and the less likely they are to disperse. A lot of these people are young people. One of the motivating factors might be if a young person in their 20s, for example, or even younger, there's been a couple of teenagers actually that have been killed, which is very, very, very sad. I think as young as 14. Um, but um, these people, their motivation might be, what do I have to lose? I have no future because this country is economically shit, right? Um, and among other things. Now, if it's just economy, if it's just the economy that they're worried about, these protests will go away. Why? Because economic protests don't have, I don't think, have the force of conviction. The economy changes back and forth. There are fluctuations in any country's economic situation. And while the economy might suck right now, there are things that can be done to make it better, and the regime can do those things to stay in power. Okay, but if it's more than that, if it's the system itself that is motivating people to rise up, and it appears that it is, then there's more conviction there. These protests might last longer. And you saw in 2022, it was that conviction for the women's movement there. They wanted a lessening of the restriction on the on women wearing the hijab and everything, right? I would need to go into more detail about what exactly. I know what caused that was the death of a woman, a young woman who was not wearing a hijab at the hands of the moral police there, right? That's what caused it. Um, but those eventually petered out. Those eventually ended. Massive crackdown on those people. Okay, but they lasted a lot longer. So we'll see if that is the case here. We'll see if that there is more motivation, more conviction in these protests to finally overturn the regime. Now, here's the problem. Whenever a popular uprising happens, there are factors that that determine whether they can even potentially be successful. Okay, one of those is arms. If you are unarmed and you're just out there in the street, what power do you have over the forces of the regime that can shoot and kill you, right? So that's one thing that really limits any social movement in its effectiveness. There have been reports that uh, protesters have occupied police buildings, uh, uh, disarmed police units, and taken their weapons, and potentially have used those weapons against police forces in further events. Right? It does not seem that is widespread. If it does get more and more widespread, then the regime actually has an even more serious situation to contend with. You also have, uh, I believe, in the northwestern region of Iran, you have Kurdish um, ethnic group, the Kurdish ethnic group, who do have some militias there that are armed. I will come back and have more detail on that information, but the Kurdish ethnic group has posed a problem for Iran in the past, and they um, I will have to come back with more information about that. But if the Kurdish groups that are capable of doing this do start taking a larger interest in these protests and a more active approach, that is a direct threat to the regime, and that would be a good sign. Apparently, there is a call for a boycott, uh, not a boycott. What's the word I'm looking for? Strike, a general strike of businesses on Thursday. We'll see how widespread that is, how far that goes. If the entire country ends up getting shut down and people can be out in the streets more, we'll see if there are those millions of protesters out in the street. Okay. Now, there's another factor, excuse me, that we have to consider. The rhetoric of the Iranian regime has been to attack rhetorically Israel and the United States and warn us to stay out, stop talking about the protests, stop inciting the protests and all that. One of the concerns I have is whenever a regime feels at risk, they might create a situation that they intend to build unity of their people that ends up in their hope um, causing protests to disperse, causing people to rally around the regime because they feel a threat of an external power. So I do suspect that there is a strong possibility. I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but there is a strong possibility that the Iranian regime will eventually attack Israel or U.S. forces in the region to create that external conflict. Now, I previously posted on X, I believe, 3 days ago, that I was looking at the next 48 hours as to determining the momentum of these protests and seeing if I could see some sort of momentum and see some sort of something that I could use to gauge what might happen in the future. As of right now, I think these protests continue for a significant period of time. Uh, any outside intervention notwithstanding, and I'll get to that in a moment, or outside intervention or outside, Iranian caused external crisis, as I mentioned, a potential attack on Israel or a potential attack on U.S. forces in the region, that sort of thing. So I do think these protests will continue. What scale they continue, whether they increase in uh, the numbers of attendance and the numbers of actual protests or decrease. Again, it appears that they might generally increase over time, even with the repressive tactics of the regime. It remains to be seen. We'll see what happens with this strike on Thursday. Um, Now, as far as the external incitement of protests, um, I you can tell I enjoy this. President Trump has stated already that the Iranian regime better not kill protesters or the United States will get involved. I'm not obviously not quoting and paraphrasing what he says, but I think this is a key signal that the U.S. is significantly interested in the events in Iran. Unlike 2009, I believe it was, where there was a massive series of protests during the Obama, I almost said Obama regime, but the first term of the Obama administration, where protests went on for a significant period of time. This was about the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and people were out there protesting because they thought it was illegitimate. I could get into detail more about that later for historical analysis, if it seems more relevant. But the problem with that, really, the problem I'm highlighting is that Obama didn't say anything until the protest pretty much had already gone away. They were on the you know backside of the protests, right? They were on the backside, the decline of the movement, and then he said something that was like just fake, just empty words, right? Here, Trump pretty much says something right away, within a few days. Once you realize the protests are going to stick around, he said something. And what's interesting is to me is that the Iranian regime had already started killing protesters by the time he said they better not kill protesters or the U.S. will get involved. So um, it's I'm not there's no guarantees of anything, but I think it is a good possibility that the United States will act in some way to aid the Iranian people in overthrowing the regime, if that is truly their intent and that is truly a possibility. I'm not sure what that looks like. Um, I'm really not sure what that looks like. I want to take my hope and balance it against reality. Like, do we really expect President Trump to take the action he took against Maduro against Khomeini, or not raise, I'm sorry, Pezeshkian, um, the current Iranian president? So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. There have to be considerations as to what the aftermath of that is, as is clearly the case when it comes to taking out Maduro. There was clearly an assessment that was best to just take him out and put pressure on the remaining existing political structure in Venezuela. And I imagine a similar calculation is going to have to be done in terms of whether the Iranian regime is going to be dealt with by a similar method. Um, yeah, I find the possibility of that. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people said, "Oh, no, 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 we shouldn't do that. No, 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 don't do that. We're causing more chaos. There's already chaos in the region, and here's the reason why we should do something about the Iranian regime. Their tentacles span into so many different spheres that everyone really should want this Islamic theocratic dictatorship to fall. So for those on, well, I wouldn't even say it's on the left. I support Ukraine. I want them to win their war. But here's the thing: Iranian drones and missiles are being sold to Russia and used against Ukrainian civilians. Let's be honest here. Russia isn't attacking military infrastructure, they're attacking civilians. And that's a result of the Iranian missiles that are being used there. And sorry about that. I did this yesterday. Um, Text message. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's one issue that would be eliminated, and it would put pressure on Russia to the extent that, okay, now they lost a source of military materiel to use against Ukraine. Okay. Um, On the other hand, you have Iran funding a lot of terror proxies, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas. Um, there's, in fact, there is a connection between Hezbollah and Venezuela, which is crazy to think that you have these terrorist organizations that are actually involved, whether it's with the drugs or anything else, in a country in our hemisphere, in our region. Um, and I can explore the connection there, uh, and put that up at a later date, but it is there. I know at some point I'm going to do a podcast where I actually have, hard facts that are indisputable, or relatively indisputable, because I know a lot of what I say is like, oh, is that actually really what's happening? And I'm being careful not to say things that I know uh, are not necessarily verified. But what I am saying has been, I just don't have a source offhand for you. But in any case, these things are happening. Iran is one of the nexuses, or nexuses of a lot of the chaos that has been going on in this world for the last couple of decades at least. Okay, they're funding Hezbollah, they're funding Hamas. We already see what happened with that, right? Iran was behind, in part. I mean, they pushed the October 7th attack against Israel that killed 1,500 people. And I have no idea why everyone is saying 1,200 people, it's 1,500, but uh, whatever, that's beside the point. Iran is behind a lot. If the regime falls, the region is going to become more stabilized, not less stabilized. Okay, even with no consideration of who replaces the regime, because you can't get any worse than what is already there. Okay, you can't get worse than an eschatological, a regime that views the world in terms of the end times, right? That is what their focus is. They don't have the same uh, uh, geopolitical assessment that the United States or even Russia might have, okay? Or anyone in the West. They are not going to hold themselves back over concerns of mutually assured destruction. Because in the Ayatollah's view, in the mullah's view, they need to create this chaos in the world for their end times uh, theology to happen. Okay, it's strange to some degree what Shia Islam believes about the end times and the Mahdi, and again, something I can come back to with more detailed information, but that's not the point of this right now. So there is very good reason to look at to want the Iranian regime as it is constituted now to fall. What comes after that? Yes, that's going to be a significant question. Okay, you do have possibility that the exiled prince Reza Pahlavi could come back in as an interim leader, okay, who has some general respect within the country, bring the different ethnic communities that comprise Iran and all the interests together to come to a a decision on the future, the political future of Iran. Now, Pahlavi has said that he wants democracy to be the ruling ideology in Iran. He wants a secular democracy in Iran. So whether that means a constitutional monarchy, constitutional republican monarchy like Britain has, I don't even think that's his interest. I don't think he really has an interest in a a continuation of the old monarchy, but he does want democracy, a secular democracy, to come back to Iran, because they did at one point have a relatively secular democracy under the Shah, for all the issues that were there at the time, of course, but I mean, let me put it this way: there were genuine reasons for discontent at the time that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 occurred. Okay, the answer to those concerns was not the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and it is not Marxism, and it is not revolution. Radical. Sorry, is not fundamentalist Shia Islam theocratic rule, and I call this the Black and Red Alliance. Red being the Marxists, black being the Islamists. That's not the answer to the problem. Okay, and Iran has a great potential to address the concerns that it faces now if they get rid of the regime, and I am very hopeful that they do. So, to sum up, I am concerned about the possibility of an Iranian attack on Israel or on U.S. forces or both in the region to distract from the protests. I'm worried about the crackdown on protests, the number of casualties at the hands of the regime's forces. Uh, I am looking at whether the Kurdish political parties and militias in the northwest will get more actively involved and provide some sort of actual force against the regime that people can stand behind. I'm looking at whether these protests will increase in size and scope, and the geographic dispersion, the number of people, the number of protests. If that continues to increase, the regime definitely has a huge crisis on its hand. And finally, I'm looking at uh, what is the timeline or the potential of a U.S. involvement in Iran along the similar lines to what we did with Maduro. I don't think Khamenei will end up coming out of that alive. Who knows? As far as the Iranian president, he's not as bad, but he's still part of the regime. So we'll see what happens there. And uh, for future, down the road, if things start, build up to this crescendo of the regime does actually appear to be on its way out, whether the Iranian people want Reza Pahlavi to come back and lead them in an interim capacity until they can get free and fair democratic elections and a secular constitution written and all of those things done, or is there something else that the people want, and is there going to be this conflict between these two thought processes? Okay, but that is later down the road. I wanted to get this podcast out because things seem to have been going a little bit quick as of late. I mean, these protests could escalate real quickly, or they could peter out real quickly, or Trump could decide to take out Khamenei like that. So I appreciate you listening to this podcast. In the future, podcasts will be about 20 to 30 minutes. This one is about 28 minutes right now. I'm not going to focus on international events and all that all the time, but over the last few days, there have been good reason for me to focus on Venezuela and Iran, and I'll continue doing that to whatever extent I need to cover the things that I think matter to Americans and on either side of the aisle, what you care about, why you should care about it. I mean, why you're right, why you're wrong. But I appreciate listening. Thank you.